Hey, hello everybody. Today we are talking about building psychologically safe teams. Just a word of warning, when I was putting these slides together, I was convinced that I was spelling psychologically wrong by the end of it, despite the fact that it's clearly correct, and it appears so many times in this presentation that it will begin to look weird. Just so there you'll find that now, but there we go. I'm Tim. I am a process and productivity consultant, and I have a small consultancy called Make Work Work Better, and we are all about how the way we work impacts the way we feel at work, and how can we make work more enjoyable, more effective, more efficient, more inspiring for people through thinking about how it works. That's what I do now, but back in the day, I was a terrible manager. I was, like many people, I became a manager because I'm good at something else. And that's why I believe I'm highly qualified to talk to you all about the pitfalls of becoming a new manager. And all of the things that, because now I'm a pretty good manager now, I like to think, but there's a whole bunch of stuff about the realities of managing people and managing teams that no one ever teaches you. And one of those things is about psychological safety and how to create an environment in which people can be their best. So that we're really clear, though, on psychological safety, given that that's what I'm going to be talking about for kind of the next 40 minutes or so, we should probably get on the same page as to what psychological safety is. So if you could all find the chat function, please. Hopefully you can see the button, I think on Zoom, it's possibly down the bottom somewhere, at the chat function. And I'd just like to pop in the chat, which letter is the correct definition of psychological safety. So is psychological safety A, when employees have no accountability for their mistakes and there are no negative consequences to failure? Is it B, when employees feel that they can voice concerns, raise objections, and ask questions without fearing it will result in negative consequences? Or is it C, potential hazards to mental health arising from factors directly relating to work or interpersonal interactions at work? Okay, so if you can get into the chat and put some so maybe put it in the Q&A, if that's okay. Put it in the Q&A if you can't get to the chat. That is the button. So we've got a few people. We've got some B's. Someone said B and C. B and B, 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 B. So we've got a majority of B's, with a couple of people saying maybe C as well. So you'll be pleased to know that, yes, it is B. One thing that's really, really important for us to call out, and we'll get into it a bit later, it is absolutely not A. All right? Psychological safety is not, you can get something horrifically wrong and there are no consequences to that. There's a really disappointing article in Harvard Business Review right towards the end of last year, where that was kind of their the argument was, can you have too much psychological safety? And the argument was that, well, if people don't have accountability for mistakes, then businesses will fail. So, well, that's not what it is. So it is when employees feel they can voice concerns, raise objections, and ask questions without fearing it will result in negative consequences. Just a little note on C. C is the definition of what we might refer to as psychosocial risk. And there is a whole ISO, health and safety ISO standard, ISO 45003, that I do an awesome webinar on, where we talk about the difference between psychosocial risk and psychological safety. So it's a really important distinction to try and make. So when we talk about potential hazards to mental health arising from work, such as workload being too much, or indeed having a manager who is not giving you what you need as an employee, that's what we might term psychosocial risk. It's not psychological safety. And we're talking about psychological safety today. Brilliant. Everyone gets it. Everyone's on the same page. We are happy. So what, in order to tie this kind of to risk management specifically, psychological safety is kind of a bracket, an overarching bracket of a term that you will you may be familiar with, you may have come across, or you maybe deal with more regularly, which is safety voice. So safety voice is the act of speaking up to prevent physical harm from hazardous situations. So we know that if you want a good safety culture, you need people to speak up. You need people to report risk. You need people to act in a way which is which will help for hazardous situations to not turn into accidents and hazards. You want people to be able to report risk in a way which is not detrimental to them. So in order to enable safety voice, in order to enable a good culture of safety, you need psychological safety. But psychological safety is more than just the act of speaking up to prevent physical harm from hazardous situations. It encapsulates that, but it also encapsulates speaking up to raise a concern about a course of action the business is taking which may be unethical. Or it is also the act of speaking up within a team if you're uncomfortable with the way that the team conversation is going, maybe from either from a business perspective or from a personal perspective. It's the ability to speak up and raise concerns in whatever context it will be. Safety voice is one example of that. But what they all have in common is they are all about reporting and making changes to the status quo. So there's a sense that the things, how they are now, are not how we want them to be, and I feel enabled to contribute to that. And there are a bunch of different reasons that is useful in business. So one is learning. Learning from mistakes. We can't learn from mistakes if we are not able to share what those mistakes are. Okay, so one of the really important things about psychological safety, it enables teams to learn and learn fast. We'll get into that a little bit, some examples of that in a little bit. So benefits of, if we talk about benefits of psychological safety, why psychological safety is something that you should aspire to creating in your teams. Learning from mistakes, hugely important. The second one is improving performance. And that could be improving performance for an individual, improving performance for a team. It's especially important for improving process performance and process quality. If you don't have psychological safety, it's more difficult to learn from mistakes, and therefore it's more difficult to improve the performance of the team because you don't know what you don't know. Okay, so learning and performance, two really important things as a manager that are key parts of your role as a manager. Psychological safety enables both of those. Psychological safety is also really important for engagement. I'm a firm believer, and a fundamental tenet of Make Work Better is that people like being good at their jobs. And if people are able to be good at their jobs, they become more engaged. And if you as an employee, if the people in your team as employees feel that they are able to contribute in a meaningful way, they will become more engaged. Psychological safety enables that. So again, engagement is something that as managers, it's a really important part of our roles as managers, is to keep our teams engaged, and through providing psychological safety, it makes that easier. And finally, innovation. This is a particular area where psychological safety, there's quite a lot of research, and Amy Edmonton's book, The Fearless Organization, is great on this one in particular. Organizations that have strong psychological safety are often able to be more innovative. They're able to have step changes in the way that they deliver their work. They're able to come up with new ways of doing things because people are trusted and feel capable to suggest things or do things that are potentially outside of what they would do normally without fear of negative consequences. So it's not only psychological safety that leads to innovation, but you will not get the same levels of adoption of innovation within an organization if you don't have a degree of psychological safety. So 4 really important business areas that managers are often measured on or targeted against or made accountable for: learning, performance, engagement, innovation, all fed through adopting psychological safety within an organization. So that's why it's important. That's why we're here to talk about it. It's not very straightforward, though. It's not easy. It's and does require, as managers, you to be as intentional and as focused and as understanding as a person as you can be. It's the hardest thing I find in a team, especially if you're busy and if you've got lots and lots of things going on, in order to give the space that doing this, that creating the right environment needs. So let's talk a little bit about what gets in the way. Let's talk a little bit about the barriers and the warnings. So what gets in the way of psychological safety? And there are the kind of 4 areas, and we'll talk about the things you can do about those 4 areas as we get into this kind of next half hour or so. So number 1 is fear. Fear is the biggest reason that people do not have psychological safety. Fear of reprisal, fear of punishment, fear of losing their, it's impacting their career in the future. If I say this, that person's going to that person's going to kibosh any career chances I've got. If I say this, this is going to make me stand out in a situation that I don't want to be standing out in. If I do this, then. And that's the biggest thing. That's psychological safety is an absence of fear in this situation. That is the number 1 thing that we need to be thinking about. So as a manager, things that you can do to reduce that fear and put yourself in that situation. What creates that situation for you? We'll get into some techniques, some very, very specific techniques. But number 1, the biggest barrier to psychological safety, where there is fear, you cannot have psychological safety. Now, sometimes you can get to a stage where you've managed to reduce the level of fear and you've developed a level of psychological safety in the team, but it's still not complete. And it's because now you've not got fear, but you've got apathy. And this tends to come from when people are putting themselves forward and people are opening up and people are taking that risk, taking that leap, and absolutely nothing happens as a result. You sometimes hear about survey fatigue. Are employees in organizations suffering from survey fatigue? Now, I don't believe there's such a thing as survey fatigue. I believe there is such a thing as lack of action off the back of a survey fatigue. People quite like being asked for their opinions, and it's, if you're asking information from people, then they will give the information. People like giving you their opinions, but they will stop doing it. And they'll stop doing it quite quickly when they don't feel like there's any point. So as a leader, as a manager, your role, the thing you can do to avoid this is show where those, where impact from people's thoughts has made a difference. People aren't great, actually. Employees in larger organizations in particular are not great at joining the dots themselves. Something will happen that will be a benefit or of benefit to them that has been done in response to feedback, but they won't always draw the line themselves. Making sure that you're explicitly drawing the line between we've changed this thing because you said this thing is really, really, really important. But also the opposite. We're not great at doing the opposite. Feeding back. We aren't doing this thing that came out of your suggestion, and this is why. It's not just that we've ignored you. Okay, so apathy it can be driven by a lack of action, by a perceived lack of response, and you've gone to all that work to reduce the level of fear in the team, and that's the hard bit. But apathy can follow really, really quickly afterwards. So we need to be super, super careful that we're constantly engaged in that dialogue. The other thing that can happen is the fear is rejection. People feel like my ideas are dismissed. I put my ideas out there and they've just been dismissed. This is not the same thing as apathy, because apathy is that I felt like my idea was listened to and nothing's happened. Rejection is that I put my idea out there and it was kind of knocked back. I can say things, but it doesn't mean anything. And the sort of slightly less active cousin of that is discouragement. So this is where, whereas rejection would be I put forward an idea and it was dismissed or rejected, discouragement is I just don't feel like I'm being listened to. I'm willing to speak up, but I don't have the chance to speak up. And that will quite often come from members of the team who are not accustomed to being given that space. If you've got quieter team members, or if you've got team members with louder characters in there who might dominate, then you might find some people push themselves to the edges a little bit, and although they're willing to speak up, don't. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to address those two in the way that you behave as managers as well. But fear, removing fear is the hardest part of it. Apathy, rejection, discouragement is all about how you in the moment and across the course respond to the ideas that come out of reducing that fear. Okay, so those are the barriers, and we're going to talk now about some things that you can do in order to try and drive those out of your team. A little bit of a watch out though, okay? Being able to speak up about a mistake without fear of consequence. So if we're thinking about if someone has made an error, and so the number one thing that you want to be sort of starting to get people to talk about is if there has been a mistake and someone feels able to tell you there has been a mistake without worrying that telling you the consequences of telling you about it will be detrimental to them. That is not the same as having to deal with someone making the mistake in the first place. Okay, so and you need to make those two things slightly. I'll give you an example. Okay, I used to have a team member in a team that I had, and she was good at her job, but her attention to detail was sometimes a little bit lacking. She was sometimes a little bit she was described by some people sometimes a little bit slapdash was how she was described to me by somebody. And we did have some occasions in which there were errors in her work, and she was very good at saying, yeah, hold my hand up, I made a mistake there. I made a mistake. I made a mistake in this piece of work. And I was like, great, I'm glad you recognized that. And then a couple of weeks later, something else came through. She's, yeah, hold my hand up, I made a mistake. Great. Okay, good. Third time, kind of, it's okay. I really love that you're taking on board that it was your mistake and you made a mistake. How do we stop it happening? Because accepting you have made a mistake is great, but if it keeps happening, then it sort of suggests to me that you don't care. It's not okay. Admitting that there has been a mistake is not the same as removing the consequences of the mistake. The other example of this that I ran into a few times in the public sphere. Some of you may be aware of the organisation Brewdog. They had some quite high profile problems with behaviour and in their organisation a little while ago. So it was in the press. Again, their CEO, he's very, very quick to go, yes, we made mistakes. We own those mistakes, but the mistakes kept happening. Okay, so the mistake and the recognition of the mistake are different things. We should give people the psychological safety to be able to admit when they've made mistakes, but we need to make sure that we are using that to, if you remember, learn from our mistakes. So the way that there are two things that I want to kind of demonstrate here about that, and one is that W. Edwards Deming, who's a process consultant back in sort of 1950s, post Second World War, was a big influence on what happened with Toyota around lean manufacturing. And in his book, Out of the Crisis, he says, a bad process beats a good person every time. Yeah. So, and if you kind of think this whole thing, people like being good at their jobs. And I also fundamentally believe not only do people like being good at their jobs, no one goes to work to do a bad job. So if you're having this conversation, if someone comes to you and says, I made a mistake here, that's great because you can respond to it. I had a role for a little while where it was drummed into me from day one. If you make a mistake, you need to tell us straight away, because that if we don't know about that mistake straight away, then that could have implications further down the line. If you tell us straight away, we can sort it out. You won't be in trouble for making a mistake and telling us. You'll be in more trouble for making a mistake and not telling us than you will for making a mistake and telling us. And I really understood that, and I trusted them, and that was proven to be the case. What I loved about the fact that when that happened was when I said, oh, I've made this error, it wouldn't be a why did you do that? It would be a how do you think that happened? Because a bad process beats a good person every time. I was quite good at that job, but the means by which I did a lot of my work was hard, and we were able to improve things by looking at the mistake. So if you can lean into that, if you can make it really clear within your team that actually the outcome of admitting to a mistake is much preferable to the outcome of pretending you haven't made a mistake, not just for the individual, but for the team and for the business. And actually that a mistake is an opportunity to improve. And if you can actually make that a real thing, not just words, enabling those people to explain why they made a mistake and explain what's happened, and then make it less easy for that mistake to happen in the future, not only will you build psychological safety within the team, but you will end up with a better product at the end of it. And let's just remember, psychological safety is not the goal. Okay, the point of this is not psychological safety. So psychological safety is an enabler to having a high-functioning team. And a high-functioning team is an enabler to doing good work and enjoying doing good work. So the point is not to have a high degree of psychological safety. The point is to do a good job. And psychological safety will get you there. So think about this: a bad process beats a good person every time, and treat mistakes as an opportunity to learn about how the work is done. And that's how you can. For me, it's always been my best way of dealing with that distinction between you have psychological safety to speak up, but we still expect you to do your job well. The other thing to watch out for is measurement. So Eli Goldratt, who wrote a book called The Goal, which is a process improvement novel, thriller type thing. It's not brilliantly written. It's a bit. I don't want to make any comparisons and offend anybody's reading taste. It's not brilliantly written, but it's a great book on the idea of measurement, and a great book on the idea of constraints within a process. And he once said, if you tell me how you measure me, I will tell you how I will behave. What he's saying there is that all measurement has consequences to the way that somebody behaves. If you think about last time you raised an IT ticket and it got closed without your issue being fixed, that's because the person who's responsible for that IT ticket is being measured on how many tickets they close in a day, not how many customers they have who are happy at the end of the day. And therefore, they're looking for every opportunity to close that ticket. How does that impact psychological safety? Well, let's think about the whole thing about safety voice. Let's think about how we measure that. If you are measuring, if somebody has a measurement against them, which is about reducing the number of reported safety risks in their business area, then it is in their interests to reduce the number of reported safety risks. It is not within their interest. It's not in their interests to uncover more safety risks and then fix them. So if the measurement, or if the culture of measurement in an organization is going to encourage people to not speak up, then you will end up, it's more difficult to encourage people to do it, because people won't do things that disadvantage them. We just don't do it. It's just not a thing that is very, very difficult. I am going to do this thing despite the fact it's going to make my life more difficult. So if you're looking at the way that your team is measured, think about, have we got the right measure? Or look at it what is the worst possible behavior that could be enabled by this measurement? If someone was to maliciously comply with this measurement that we have put in place, what would they be doing? And is that okay? So if you think about how a bad process beats a good person every time, and you think about tell me how you measure me and I'll tell you how I will behave. Those are things that you as a manager can influence in the way that you have the conversations and the way that you set people up for success, that will reduce some of the fears that can impede psychological safety in a team. So also thinking about fears, and also thinking about making it safe for people to speak, is we should probably talk about boundaries. Boundaries in teams, really, really important. And psychological safety is not a lack of boundaries. In fact, if you want people to have psychological safety and feel like they can speak up without fear of negative consequences, then it needs to be really clear about what and how they can speak up about and in what way. Okay, think about it like content moderation on social media. So, like, you want to be comfortable that the things that you're saying are going to be acceptable to all the people around you. So, as an example, and you know, you can set this up in a very sort of clear sort of team charter type way. You can do it as a conversation. So, as a team, is swearing okay? Do we think as a team it's okay to swear? Because if we don't think it's okay to swear as a team, let's just say, right, okay, we have we want everybody to feel open about being able to share their to share things. We'd rather you didn't swear while you did it. How far does this extend within the team and views around politics or religion or things like that? Putting clear boundaries around what conversations are acceptable within a work environment is an important way of making sure that if somebody goes, I don't know whether I can say this in a team, then you're not going to hear it. Whereas if you've got a very clear expectations around these are the sort of things that as a business we do not tolerate, then people will be clear. I think if you've ever come across any Brené Brown, this is one of the things that Brené Brown says that I always come back to. Clear is kind. Giving people the boundaries, the guardrails, where they kind of know, if I stay within these boundaries and guardrails, I'm safe. I can if I realize that I can voice my opinions about things I'm uncomfortable about within the business, and as long as I'm not being disrespectful directly to somebody within the room, and I'm not doing something which is going to incite a massive argument about something that's not related to work, and I understand that the way that I phrase this is important, that is good, and I can do that. If there's kind of you can say what you like and then we'll decide whether it's okay afterwards, no one's going to do it. So boundaries, what's acceptable speech? Now I can hear some of you going, but Tim, we want to encourage people to share speech. We want to encourage people to say what's on their minds. Yes, we do. But there is a certain amount of, an example might be, if you have you might say, what isn't acceptable within the team is that we don't specifically finger point at individuals who we don't believe are good at their jobs. It's not acceptable to say that person is bad at their job. But it is okay to say, this thing is happening in a certain part of the business. This is how we know this is happening in this part of the business. And we want to know about that. So the finger pointing at individuals within this particular context is not acceptable. Okay. That isn't saying that people are not allowed to say things. It just means that people have to come up with maybe more evidence-based or more or less individually focused ways of expressing the opinion that they have, which will then probably lead to a more open discussion that could maybe involve that person in a way that is more constructive. So think about the things that could occur, the boundaries the things that could occur that would shut down the speech, and try and avoid those as much as possible. You want people to feel comfortable sharing and raising their heads above the parapet without worrying they're going to say the wrong thing. So clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Make it really obvious what the wrong thing to say would look like. It's a fine line. I know it's a fine line, and some of you sitting there going, That's the opposite of what you were saying earlier. Guardrails. Give people guardrails. One way of doing guardrails is through feedback and having a really, really clear way that everyone understands how to give and receive feedback. And this is one of the, as it was kind of getting into the back end of the webinar, I'm going to sort of suggest the model. If you don't have a model for giving feedback within your team, then this is a really good one. I've used it myself in numerous organizations. I've had like 2 or 3 instances where it hasn't worked for me. For the most part, it works. And that is, so you think about giving feedback. Now, feedback can be anything. Feedback can be, this didn't go the way that I would like it to go, or it could be, this went really, really well. And what we need to be better at as managers generally is giving good feedback about why things went well. If you think about conversations that you might have had as a manager, if something's gone badly, you are probably up to here with detail, and it will probably be a longer conversation than if something's gone very well, when you will just say, good job, and leave it at that. And it's actually really, it's more helpful in some ways for you to say to someone, I really liked the way that you did this thing because it had this impact for me. And then they'll know what to do again next time. We should encourage people to improve and grow through repeating the good things as much as we should through avoiding the bad things. And so this is what's really important around having a good, natural way of learning to give and receive feedback. So here's the model. Feedback starts with an observation. It starts with a thing that happened. This is the hardest bit because you need to be really, really good at separating the objective observation from how you felt about it. You were a bit defensive today is not an observation. That's how you feel about the way that somebody responded. But saying, today, when I suggested that we might need to change the process, you responded in a way that made me feel the impact that you weren't listening to the suggestion. Okay? And so what you're saying is this thing happened and this was the impact it had. So again, let's give another example. So yesterday, you were quite careless yesterday when you were loading the van. Is not good. Yesterday, when you were loading the van, we ended up with 3 boxes that got damaged. The impact of this was that we needed to unpack the van and repack it. That's a thing that happened and an impact. You were careless is something that is immediately going to put someone on the back foot. So the idea should be, your observation is something that that person will agree with. This was a thing that happened. The impact is then on you, and it needs to come from you. If there is it's really difficult to do third-party feedback. This made this person feel like this, or this made the team generally feel like, is not as powerful or useful in this situation. It's like, I felt like this. Both of these things are not things that can be argued with. This is a thing that happened, and this is how I feel, are not things that somebody can argue with. Then you have a pause, and you let that sink in, and you let the person breathe. And then you make a suggestion. And the suggestion should be something practical that they can implement, which again is kind of lacking value. So don't say, so I suggest next time you're more careful when loading the van. You said, maybe next time just try doing 1 box at a time. They're quite heavy, it might be, it might be easier. And then you leave it with them. Equally important within the team is working with this model it works both ways. So in order to receive the feedback, you listen to the observation, you listen to the impact, you don't respond at this point. When you're given the pause, allow yourself to absorb what has been said, and then when the suggestion is made, you say thank you. Because it's not easy giving feedback, and that person has put themselves through quite a not inconsiderable amount of sort of mind-jumping stress in order to get to the point where they're able to do that for you. Okay. It's very, very effective if you can learn to do it well. It takes practice. I used to practice within my team, giving each other feedback about, you know, fairly small things, but we made a point of trying to do it in order that we could all get used to the idea that this is a normal thing. And we do it about good things and we do it about things that were less good, which did mean that what it removes then is that sense of anxiety when someone said, so yesterday when you did such things, you go, oh no, I'm going to get told off, just in a nice way. You don't want it to be that. You want it to just be a normal thing. If you can develop a good feedback habit, then it removes the fear. It also enables you to deliver some of the other things that we talked about earlier, like remove some of those barriers. So last week in the team meeting, you suggested that we might want to think about doing this thing. And I went away and I thought about it, and I spoke to some people about it, and this is why we're not doing it. You can roll all of that into the feedback so that people understand that they are being listened to. And the fact that somebody has not been, that something has not happened, isn't because they're not being listened to. It's because there's other stuff going on and that has never been explained to them. So in 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, Patrick Lencioni says, a reasonable person does not need to get their own way. They just need to feel like they've been listened to. And I know reasonable is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, but it's the point stands, I think. So make an observation, describe the impact it had on you, give a bit of a pause, and then make a suggestion. It's hard, it requires practice, but it's the best way of starting to open up conversations through feedback. I've got one more tip. I mentioned this in the first webinar back, but I want to give you a little bit more information about how to do it. And that is check-ins, or sometimes they're called huddles or stand-ups, or spot meeting is something that I use sometimes. These are short, daily, regular team catch-ups, which are amazing for creating a level of trust and accountability and transparency within a team, especially new teams. They're great for new teams, but you can work in, and they're great for remote teams, but they'll work with teams of most stripes, to be honest. This is why I call them a spot meeting, because you've got 4 things that you talk about. So you talk about what's your status. Some people might want to call that mood or feeling. How are you today? Do you need any help? Literally, how are you today? Do you need any help? And teams might choose to have red or green statuses, or smiley face, frowny face statuses, or whatever. But it's literally, I'm good. I don't need any help today, or I have a concern. And that concern could be, I have a dentist appointment this afternoon, but I also have a deadline at the end of the day. It'd be really helpful to me if I could skip the team meeting so I could get everything together. Is that acceptable to everybody? Or it could be something where I'm really worried that we've not actually thought about the impact of the Q2 reforecast on what's going to happen at the end of the year. So it's the concern. So you have an opportunity to raise a concern. Do you need help? Do you have any concerns? Progress is where you look at measurement. That could be one of 2 things. It could be, what are your team measures? What are the things that you're looking at that are going to drive success? How are you doing against those? Or, put more simply, 3 questions. How have you got on since the last time we spoke? What's the most important thing you're going to be doing today? Is anything getting in your way? It's your opportunity to update people briefly on where you're at in your work, and flag when something's getting in the way. So today, my main focus is to deliver the report to Dave, but I've not had the figures that I need from finance yet. So that's my obstacle. And sometimes maybe in that moment, because you're speaking frequently, somebody else might be able to go, oh, well, I've got a meeting with finance later, so I can pick that up before you, if you like. You can start to get involved in each other's stuff. You can also start to do, work out how you're going to unblock those blockers. Obstacles is where you do your problem solving, and that's usually a bit more structured. So if you've got something that's come out of your blockers in your progress, where you said, actually, it's now a week later and you've still not got that data from finance, something's going on, what's happening? This is where you can discuss that, and you can start to get plans in place that might involve other people in order to try and move those things along. But you're discussing them in a more structured way that enables you to move things forward. And then finally, triumphs. What went well? What's gone well since the last time we spoke? I think that should be work related or personal, because we're whole people. I think it's really important to finish on these. Couple of reasons why, because from what I said before, we should grow through recognizing what's gone well, as much as we should grow through fixing what's not gone well. Also, when you've just spent your time talking about whether you need any help, how you're getting on, and what's getting in your way, it's quite nice to finish on a high. And for me, this is where I always get to know my teams the best, because quite often their triumphs will be something that's really, it's nice to see what makes people smile, and you can learn a lot about people from what makes them smile, and that's how you start to build the trust upon which psychological safety relies. I've just banged through that 40 minutes very, very quickly, and there's quite a lot in it. So I'm going to open it up to questions if there are any, Sue.
Right, yeah, we've got some. That's great.
I hear you, Sue.
You can hear me?
Oh, I can now, yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, just a bit of a lag, I think. So the first question then is about, does leadership, or does my leadership style affect the psychological safety of my team? Or can it affect?
Well, it can affect it, yes, absolutely. I think you need to have what's sometimes termed, if you are very command and control, then you will not, it is unlikely you will create enough space to give people the opportunity to speak up. If you always have the answer, if you're always the first and last person to speak, then, and if you do most of the speaking, you will not be creating the space that psychological safety requires. So if, for those of you who came to my first webinar, you might remember my favorite response to almost every question is, I don't know, what do you think? That's something that I specifically adopted because I was aware that my style could be shutting down some of the less confident people in my team. Because if I was to give them an answer, then they would just take the answer because I'm their boss and I know better. Whereas actually just making that small change meant that they had an opportunity to open. So I think if your leadership style involves not giving space to other people's thoughts and opinions, then yes, it will. Absolutely. I would always, but I would encourage you more generally to lean towards a more participatory management style anyway, because it's just more effective in most cases.
Okay, thank you. I think this is more of a statement than a question, but it'd be interesting to see your views on it. Leadership promotion towards psychological safety is important. Creating safe environment to speak up and share bad news. Also learning to drive the organization.
Absolutely. No, I mean, this is kind of, I think, why when we were talking about becoming a new manager, getting this in place, having this as part of the course is important. Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially in risk management, if you don't have psychological safety, you don't have people reporting risk. So learning to build psychological safety is really important. But also to say, yes, while top leadership, and I'm assuming from that comment that you may be referring to top leadership, you can build psychological safety in your team, even in an organization where the top leadership are not building it. You can still do that. You can still have that impact on your people. In some cases, it might make things feel a bit weird, but you can still do it.
Okay, thank you. Next question then is, what is the best way of dealing with a company that is stuck in its ways when they have many negative barriers within their management style?
That's really interesting. It sort of depends on your place in that hierarchy of organization, and how comfortable you are being the person who stands out a little bit. I think if you have an organization that is primarily built of people who are command and control, which is kind of what I assume you mean by old-fashioned, then in order to change things, you've got to be a bit brave. So if you've got a senior leader who likes to swear in meetings and be a bit and likes to shout a bit and stuff, then, and I've done it before, where I've been the person who said, I hear what you're saying, but I don't appreciate the way that you're saying it to me. And then I just listen for the massive intake of breath, and sometimes that can be really impactful, and sometimes so you've got to pick your battles. It's very, very, it can be very difficult to influence it. I would be interested in, if I were you, I would want to have one-on-one conversations with some of the people to understand if there is an appetite to change, if people understand why they might need to change. It might be constructive to give some of those people feedback along the feedback line and say, so in that meeting earlier, when you swore and made a crude remark about the supplier, that made me feel like we were an unprofessional organization who don't respect the people we do business with. And just see how they respond. They might not like it, but at least you'll know whether actually change is something that you can then you can then influence. So yeah, it's a there are ways of doing it. You can, if you feel like there isn't a desire to change amongst that top leadership, and you feel like actually they recognize that they're maybe not doing things in the best way, but they don't know how to change it, then there are many leadership coaches and organizations who excel in changing it. The place I would start is by suggesting they all read 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, as it is very readable, and they'll possibly recognize quite a lot of themselves in it. And that also has a bunch of questions and recommendations and stuff at the back of it. So there is some stuff, but it's a difficult question to answer without some more specifics. But I'd start by finding out, do they even realize the impact that they have being the way they are?
Okay, thank you. Next question. When a company has grown exponentially over a short period of time, how do you keep the balance in place for huddles and making the safety voice heard?
So the thing with huddles is that they don't necessarily need to be, you can structure them how you like, really, in the way that makes most sense. So quite often you might find in a large team, and when I say team, I mean sort of in the sense of a group of people who report to a manager. And so you might have, it happened to me literally overnight. I had a team of 6 people, and then I came to work the next day. There was an all hands meeting, and by the end of that all hands meeting, by 10 o'clock, I'd got 19 people in my team. I'd basically more than tripled the size of my team in the space of one meeting. But not all of those people did the same amount of stuff. So it would have been absolutely impossible for me to continue having the huddle with my whole team as what I had. But actually, that they broke down into, whilst they weren't really sub teams because there weren't kind of other managers sitting on top of them, there were a group of people who did this like work. There were a group of people who did this like work. And so we designed the huddles in those groups. We still had a meeting cadence that enabled the whole team to speak, but it wasn't useful for the people who did X job to be involved in the day-to-day shenanigans of the people who did Y job, and so you can still structure it based on the type of work and as teams grow, those things will change. So you can be quite creative with it. The important thing is that think about the conversation that you want to happen, and how does that get facilitated the best way? Ideally, you wouldn't want more than, between 8 and 10 is an ideal size for those kind of huddles. I've seen them go up to 12, 15. They become a bit more transactional, but they still have value. So it's about how do you make sure the right conversations are happening is the important thing.
Okay, thank you. Somebody's just asked, what was the book you mentioned to read?
Oh, I mentioned a couple. I mentioned The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. I mentioned The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. I also mentioned, I can't remember if I mentioned a specific book by Brené Brown. I like Daring Greatly. But there is also Dare to Lead is also very, very good. I mentioned The Goal by Eli Goldratt, which is great if you're thinking about process and measurement in particular. And I mentioned Out of the Crisis by W. Edwards Deming, which I would only recommend if you're specifically interested in process management. It's not an easy read. He's a bit verbose, but it's something of a classic in its field. But that's more of a sort of process management, quality management kind of text.
Great, thank you. Somebody would like the link to the HBR article you mentioned. So if you'd like to send that through to me, Tim, and I'll send it out.
Of course, yes.
People, so we'll get that all to you. Thank you.
And I could also give you all the bullet points of the things I disagree with, if that's helpful.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, next question then. A lot of my team work remotely. So how do I create better psychological safety with them?
I would absolutely 100% do huddles, spot meetings, whatever you want to call them. They are absolutely invaluable for remote teams. They still work fine remotely. They're a very, very good way actually of reducing the number of chat messages, emails, that sort of thing that get pinged around, because you can start to train the team to, unless it's an emergency, save that thing for tomorrow, save that thing for tomorrow's meeting. The conclusion I've come to around remote work is that you need to speak to individuals more often than you would do if you were in the office, maybe for shorter periods of time. So whatever meeting cadence you had in the old world when you were in an office will not be sufficient. So I would start with daily spot meetings, 15 minutes every morning. It's quite a nice way to just like get everyone on the same page. This is what we're up to. And it gives people that window where they know they will get your time. And what I find very effective actually for fully remote teams is that you book, although they're only 15 minutes meetings, they should only ever run at 15 minutes, no longer, otherwise they just turn into a bit of a chat, and that's not really what you want. But I always book half an hour. So the first 15 minutes is the huddle. The second 15 minutes is just free time in my calendar for anything that comes off the call. So if someone comes to the call with a concern about a specific thing, I went to a meeting yesterday and got massive pushback from that team, and I feel like I've been completely derailed. Like, okay, well, you stay on after this and we'll come up with a plan. It's not a yes, let's have a meeting about that in 2 days' time or whatever it is. It's I've got some time blocked out in order to be able to support them. The other thing that's really useful for remote teams, from your perspective, from the point of view of them having access to you, which is a really important first step in building that psychological safety, office hours. Just give yourself like, I will just be working at my desk for 2 hours here. Drop in. I'll have a Zoom window open, drop in. And you can just do it like that. People can just drop in, ask you a question, get the time. It's a good way of being available. Because once they come, the first hurdle often is them being comfortable with you, and then they need to get comfortable with each other. For me, that's the order it tends to happen in when you're building a team, but they won't get comfortable enough with each other if they're not comfortable with you in the first place. So yeah, you need to be available and accessible.
Super, thank you. And then I think this might be the last question, but how do I ensure that everybody's opinions in the team are equally heard? Because some voices tend to be louder than others.
You just have to facilitate that, to be honest. I think there is the role that if you can, in this situation, you're trying to move away from the idea of you being the person who knows everything, you being the person who comes up with all the answers, you being the person who decides what's happening. And ultimately, you will be the person who has a stake in the decision making. You might have like the final vote or whatever, but your voice needs to be less important than everybody else's. That puts you in the role of facilitator. And that does just mean that if you've got a quieter person, ask them, or if you've got a louder person, maybe just stand them down a little. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. You could do that in the room if they're, if you're 3 questions into a 5 agenda point meeting and they're boom immediately first person speaking, you can just say, Tim, do you mind let somebody else have a go? Or shall we hear what anybody else has to say? Or you might want to deal with it one-to-one beforehand. Just go, look, I really value your input. But from and do it through the feedback model. I've observed that you are always the first person to jump in and answer a question when there's when we have a question within the team. The impact of that is the others maybe just shrink back a little bit and don't get as involved. So could we, a suggestion I'd like to make is that actually you leave some space for the others at the beginning of a meeting. They may not even be aware. I didn't know that I was doing it until I got that feedback. So there's there is a brilliant, slightly sweary stand-up comedian clip by a guy whose name has completely gone out of my head, where he talks about the lessons that he learnt, that he thinks all men, particularly in meetings, should learn, which is when you're about to say something, does it need saying? Does it need saying now? And does it need saying now by me? That has been extremely useful to me as a man in meetings, and especially as a talkative man in meetings. I also found sending that clip to a couple of people was just in a this made me laugh kind of way, was actually quite a good way of planting that seed with them. So I'll see if I can find it and I'll share that as well. But there are sometimes you can just facilitate it. Sometimes you might need to set it up with those individuals separately. That's
great. Thanks ever so much. Somebody has said thank you very much for your time this afternoon. They've really enjoyed the webinar. So I think we'll end the webinar there. Thank you ever so much again, Tim.
Not at all.
Thank you. Advice, lots of sharing your knowledge with us, but lots of good sort of hints and tips. As we've mentioned, this session is the 3rd of 4 management skills webinar as Tim has developed for IIRSM. So we've got the next one, I think, in March. So do look out for that and do join us for that. Thank you for all the great questions. Great load of questions today. The recording will be on the IIRSM Resource Hub and website. So if you're a member of IIRSM, you can access it at any time. So we'll end the webinar here now. So have a good rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks ever so much again, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.